Hello, everyone. Welcome to the USAID Asia Counter Trafficking in-person summit from Evidence to Action, hosted by Winrock International. My name is Am, and I will be your technical facilitator today to ensure that you have a smooth experience with Zoom. You are at the session titled Social Behavior Change Communication, or Sbcc, Experiences in Asia. We will begin in just a moment here, but before we get started, we wanted to cover a few technical features available to you today. Today, we are using Zoom meetings to enable as much interactivity as possible. Your participation via chat is highly encouraged, and our team will work to acknowledge and address as many comments and questions as we can throughout today's session. To help us acknowledge you and your questions and inputs, please rename yourself to your name and organization by clicking the Participants button at the bottom of your Zoom window, hovering your mouse over your name, clicking More, and then clicking Rename. I will paste these instructions in the chat right after I finish this spiel. This meeting will be recorded, so please keep your camera off unless you're invited to speak in order to help everyone have smooth connection today. We look forward to seeing you continuing the conversation in the conference community on Microsoft Teams and spark further conversations on social media using the hashtags WinRockE2A and Evidence to Action. Once again, you are at the session titled Social Behavior Change Communication Sbcc Experiences in Asia. Kun Warapon, I hand the floor over to you. Over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Am, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to the USAID Asia City Summit, and I'm very glad to be here. And before we start, let's talk about how the session is about today. So the session is about the Sbcc, so the Social Behavior Change Communication. So with our panels today, we have three of the experts that's working on the Sbcc and communication for development. So I think we can start by let them introduce themselves. So I think we can start with Tara.
Hi, hello everyone. Thanks to USAID and Winrock for the invitation to join today's discussion. My name is Tara Dermott, and I am the head of the IOM sub-office in Hong Kong. IOM is the United Nations Migration Agency, and we have 70 years of experience providing direct assistance to migrant populations and guiding migration policy. I'm here today because before moving to Hong Kong this past year, I spent close to a decade in strategic communications for counter-trafficking, first with MTV Exit and then with Iomx at the IOM Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific in Bangkok. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Tara. So we have our next panelist, which is Sarah.
Hi, everybody. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me today. My name is Sarah Rich Zendel, and I am a Shirk postdoctoral research fellow at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University in Canada. And I have been doing experimental research on the efficacy of anti-trafficking and migrant rights campaigns in both Nepal and Hong Kong, with the Human Trafficking Vulnerability Survey, which is based at York University and UC Berkeley. It's an honor to be here, and I'm excited to talk to you about my work.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And our final panelist, Daniel.
Yes, hello, everyone. Good morning. Good to be here, even if just virtually. And again, thank you to Winrock and USAID for giving us the opportunity to be here. So my name is Daniel. I'm the founder of Rapid Asia. We're a social research and consulting firm based in Bangkok. We work across a number of different thematic areas, gathering evidence for clients for change. And so far we have worked in over 30 countries in Asia and beyond.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So that's all of our panelists. And I would like to introduce myself as well. My name is Terry Warpon. I'm a social and behavior change communication specialist at the USAID Thailand CTIP at Winrock International. I will be your moderator today. So before we start to our panelist presentation and the discussion, I think we would start with the interaction with our audience to have some thought from the participants in the room about the Sbcc. So I would like everybody to join us to participate in the chat box in Zoom and to give us some of the input that you think that would be the keyword of this question. So I think Em can put that into the chat box. So our question would be, what do you think is the key factor to the success of Sbcc to influence the positive change with sustainability? I think this question is in everybody's minds. Even I think that it's very hard to answer somehow because there's a lot of this and that surrounded the key success to SBCC. But I think it's a very interesting point to see from the various point of views from people that working in different parts of Asia and also different part of the world to share on how they think it would be key success to the activity in the SBCC or how to develop the communication for change to the success. So I'm open this time to everybody to share your thought and response in the chat box. So anybody want to join? Just type on the chat box so we all can see what you think about this, and then we can have a discussion about this along the path with our presentation as well. So we have continuing connection with your audience. We have effective client stakeholder segmentation, leaving no one behind. We have a community buy-in beyond just direct clients and shareholders. We have understanding the knowledge, attitude, and practice, and continue measuring the impact of communication activities. Interesting. Okay. Anyone else that want to share this thought on the question? Understanding what prevents them from doing perceived behavior through behavioral science. I think we have like 1 more minute to have everybody share their thoughts on the chat box, and then we move to the presentation. So feel free to do it so. It's very great thought from other people here. I think you can see that people having a lot of different perspective on what is going to be the key factor that it complement to the SBCC. Even though I think like with a lot of practitioners, we also think that sometimes, even though different processes is very important to the success, but sometimes people might think it differently, that this one may be bigger one, this one maybe, might not be that bigger compared to other processes, but this is very interesting to listen to it. A lot of people. We have emphasized what they gain from it, and also addressing and balancing stakeholders' need and interests, and also create new practices and show the benefit and continue promoting it. Very nice one. I think, yeah, this very good start, and I think we can get these keywords to discuss with our panelists, but I think it's time to move to our panelist presentation. So now I think it's time to start with the first presentation with Tara from IOM. So Tara, I give you a floor now.
Great, thank you. If you could just skip ahead to the next slide. So I've already introduced IOM, but I did just want to say that IOM is one of the world's largest counter-trafficking actors. And this is because migrants are overly represented in forced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking. So this is a really important area of our work. And in 2015, with the support of USAID Asia and heavily informed by the former MTV Exit campaign, IOM launched the Iomx campaign to leverage the power and popularity of media and technology to prevent human trafficking and exploitation. Next slide, please. Now, Iomx Asia applied a Communication for Development, or C4D, evidence-based participatory approach to all of its activities. Through both quantitative and qualitative research practices, as well as engaging directly with target audience, IOM could best ensure that we achieved the intended impact. Now, our final Iomx Asia report, published last year, includes summaries of impact for each of the 5 sectors that we prioritized for the region. While it is always most challenging to shift attitudes, it was even harder for us with domestic work, as you can see from this slide, as we did a lot of employer-focused campaigning. Now, next slide. The primary audience for Iomx was people aged 15 to 35 across Asia, with emphasis on ASEAN. We also considered our audience in terms of this framework: place of origin versus destination, at the community and the individual level. Now, IOM saw the added value of Iomx to the counter-trafficking sector in source communities by providing C4D or Sbcc capacity development for community-based organizations, while also leveraging our regional mandate to focus more on host countries to make the environment less conducive for exploitative practices. Next slide, please. While IOM has had a history of applying Sbcc approaches, especially through our humanitarian and migrant health initiatives, it was really through Iomx that IOM began to more consistently apply C4D approaches to better overcome the many barriers to behavior change when it comes to migration-related issues. Now, like many, IOM uses the social ecological model as a tool for understanding the multiple levels of personal and environmental influence in a society. Each of the levels also helpfully requires a different strategic approach to communication in order to be impactful. So this next slide shows a sample of various strategic approaches most commonly employed by Iomx. Behavior change communication, which is about the individual. A great example of this was the Iomx Cotabato Roadshow in Maguindanao, Philippines. Maguindanao was flagged as an area of high outmigration of young, primarily Muslim women who migrate to become domestic workers in Malaysia and the Middle East. Working closely with the community, we initiated activities to encourage women aged 18 to 35 with expressed aspiration to migrate within the next year to check the legitimacy of their recruiter's license with POEA before migrating for work. This campaign was highly tailored with a strong emphasis on in-person engagement, community-based dialogue, and traditional media. Now, social mobilization is about the surrounding environment, family, community-based organizations, or local leaders. Iomx Bangladesh campaign took place over a 12-month period, engaging hundreds of community members across 3 districts and potentially reached an audience of over 100 million in the 2 months following its launch. It was agreed by the community that the campaign should promote both male and female aspirant migrants to check the legitimacy of their visa by contacting the District Employment and Manpower Office for advice. This campaign was designed and taken forward by the whole community, including everyone from migrants to government officials and media members. And finally, advocacy. Advocacy is about social influencers, decision makers, opinion leaders, and how they can be influenced in order to gain their support, improve service provision, promote action, foster engagement, start public debate, and so much more. Iomx's Do You Know Who Made It campaign asked young Thais to take the lead in making smart purchasing decisions that reinforce the fair treatment of workers in the manufacturing industry. In the 2 weeks following the campaign's launch, the campaign's videos were viewed over 3 million times, with 1 video trending. These videos were produced and promoted by YouTube Thailand's top creators following their participation in a series of educational and mentoring activities on the issue. Next slide, please. Now, every single one of these diverse campaign activities was designed following the P process, which Iomx translated into a structured series of activities, which we call our roadshow model. C4D is not rocket science, but these frameworks, associated tools, and guidance have enabled IOM to strengthen our outreach through equipping IOM staff and our partners with the understanding and tools that they need for Sbcc. It is also helpful to all of us to have checklists to ensure that we are not skipping steps vital to achieve desired results. Next slide. Now, Iomx has since, with new funders, gone global, launching new campaigns across Central America and West Africa. The roadshow model has also become foundational for IOM C4D initiatives beyond Iomx. This past year alone, I have directly supported colleagues in Kenya, Mongolia, the Philippines, and Vietnam to adopt and adapt these tools for the context of their new programming. Next slide, please. So at the end of 4 years of this campaign, IOM conducted an external evaluation of the Iomx Asia which was made available in 2019. The following are some, oh, sorry, I think if you can go to the slide before and the slide before this. Best C4D, yes, recommendations. So these are recommendations based on the value of C4D. Now, no doubt, if you have joined this discussion, then you already know the value of C4D, of Sbcc. But what I would like to stress is the importance of investing the human and financial resources that you have in the participatory evidence gathering part. Again and again, I advise colleagues and partners, if you have only 12 months for a campaign, spend 8 on developing content, 2 disseminating it, and 2 assessing impact to inform future activities. Now, this ratio aligns pretty well with how I recommend resource allocation as well. By investing this time in meaningful community engagement and people-centered approaches, you are almost guaranteed to reap the many benefits of higher levels of engagement, adaptive management, and sustained impact on culture and institutions. Next slide, please. So in terms of best programming practice, I want to flag online engagement. The rapid increase of social media use in this region has created incredible opportunities for potential reach and engagement of diverse audiences with tailored information. That said, it's important that we recognize the continued need to apply what we know is best for offline engagement with the development of our online campaigns. We also have to remember that the gender digital divide is real, with women and girls often having far less regular access than their male counterparts. So with the next slide, I have a lot more I can say on the subject, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, but I just wanted to highlight that all Iomx campaign reports, evaluations, tools, guidance are available at iomx.iom/IONT. And the next slide shows that there are even more recent IOM C4D resources, including some great research from IOM's Global Migration Data Analysis Center, also available online. So thanks again for this opportunity to share reflections, and I am looking forward to the discussion with all of you.
Thank you very much, Tara. This is very interesting, and I think especially for a lot of Sbcc practitioners, I think they might be very, happy to see those socio-ecological model, which is a lot of people has been moving on during that part. So I think it's time for us to, have some discussion about your presentation. I think for the panel, and also some questions from me as well. So maybe just start from the panel. Do you have Sarah or Daniel, do you have any point to discuss or have comments and suggestions on this one?
No, I mean, we've been, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah,
okay. No, I mean, we've been working with Tara for a long time, so we are well aware of, the good work they're doing. I think what stands out in Iomx work, and it also comes through very clearly in past research that we have done for them, is that they have this very structured approach with a sort of a clear goal where they want to go. And I think that is one of the key to success. That's, of course, there's a learning curve with that, and even when you have this kind of model, it doesn't always produce, the very best results. Sometimes you have really good results. Sometimes results can be even disappointing. But I think, generally speaking, having this kind of structured approach is a very good model, so that you have, clear goals and targets for what you want to achieve.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Thank you for that, Tara. And I just, I'm not as familiar with IOM's work, but something that you said stood out to me in terms of what we found with our research on the efficacy of anti-trafficking campaigns, which is just the amount of effort that needs to go into contextualizing a campaign, piloting, and making sure that it's relevant to particular audiences and populations. So that's something that definitely aligns with some of the findings that we had as well in our research. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Tara, I just have one question about the presentation. I think it's maybe for a lot of people. So I think the Sbcc is a very well structured, as I think Daniel said, that IOM use a well structured process that going through each of the steps. And you're also working on help develop the capacity of the CSO on their ability to conduct the Sbcc activities. Did you find any like constraint when you're working with this CSO organization that they feel like they might not have like enough resources to conduct such process that you have? Like they may have like financial constraint, or maybe people constraint or technicality. Can you share with us about that a little bit?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And I love it because it's super practical. So as I mentioned quite quickly in my presentation, one of the things that Iomx in our overarching regional strategy, one of the things we prioritized was opportunities for capacity development of Sbcc for our community-based partners. And the rationale behind this was actually twofold. Of course, it was to ensure that we are doing what we can to strengthen the ongoing daily outreach and engagement that has preceded IOM's activities and will continue beyond. But the other thing was that, as development practitioners, we always talk about participation, right? But we rarely talk about how burdensome that is to organizations that are already strapped for capacity, right? Every time we invite them to a workshop that is time away from their primary responsibilities, it is often time that is not compensated. So we wanted to think, how could we achieve the best results from a participatory approach, but still give back to the community? And so we did that through having very structured capacity development elements to the workshop. So we didn't just facilitate planning discussions. We made sure that people knew why we were facilitating them and the way we were facilitating them. We designed a C4D for counter-trafficking toolkit made available in the languages of the communities where we were working. And so we made sure that they understood what they were going through, so that they could replicate that across the issues, whether they were working on prevention of teen pregnancy to HIV, to any other of myriad issues that so many community-based actors are tasked with. In terms of resources, we also made sure to build into our project budget that where we were expecting organizations to support our efforts, that we were capacitating them for that. And that was really important for us. We found that it was very easy for us to leverage in-kind or even financial support from higher level partners, whether that was government or private sector. But for community-based actors, we wanted to make sure that they benefited from those resources as well.
Thank you very much. That is very interesting point of view from IOM to do the development, because I think I also agree that it's also sometimes find concern because you want to really give the input to them, a lot of it, because it's very great practices, but sometimes you find that it's also need to push the boundary of people who have the idea on working the Sbcc, because sometimes when people who is not familiar with this structure, they may find like, wow, it's a lot of process to take into the consideration. So yeah, thank you very much, Tara. I think we will move to our next presenter, which is Tara. I give your floor to you now.
Hi, everyone. So I introduced myself already, but I will say, as an academic who is less on the side of practice, it's lovely to get to hear from some development practitioners who are out there on the ground actually implementing campaigns. So it's fantastic to be here and to hear all these different perspectives. So I'm going to discuss the results of an experimental large-scale randomized control trial study on the effects of different kinds of anti-trafficking mass media campaigns that I conducted in Nepal with the principal investigators Margaret Boitin at York University and Cecilia Moe at UC Berkeley. Next slide. So given Nepal's rates of trafficking, campaigns are a common tool used to reduce vulnerability. And by studying, doing a large-scale study of the general population in Nepal and how campaigns impact their attitudes, knowledge, and behavior, we can target individuals who themselves are at the greatest risk and can report on incidences of human trafficking in their communities. Now, of course, as a researcher, it's always important to recognize that campaigns and changing hearts and minds can only do so much, and often addressing the economic context, of course, is essential to reducing incidences of trafficking campaigns. So with this background, I'm gonna talk a little bit about our research design. Next slide. So the questions that we were interested in addressing in our work were, what are the effects of campaigns on knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and practices? And are these effects enduring over time? So when we talk about sustainability, we did a longitudinal study that went back to look at the effects even 5 years down the line. And we looked at the effects of receiving any type of campaign versus not receiving a campaign. We looked at differences in the effects based on whether the campaign had a fact-based message versus a narrative or storytelling type of message. And if that message had a fear-based negative appeal or a positive appeal. And we also looked at differences in format of delivery. So if you deliver a campaign as a radio show, if you deliver it as a video or a graphic novel format. Next slide. So data collection included 3 rounds. The first round, of course, involved a pre-test survey. And then we did the random assignment of all the treatments during round 1 and did an initial post-treatment survey to look at effects in the short term. And then the subsequent rounds of data were collected 9 months and again 5 years later with the same group of original participants, and we were able to retain 75% of the original respondents in the second round and 50% in the third round. And I'm going to speed through all of this data collection stuff quickly so I can get to results, but if you have more questions, I'm happy to go into more detail in the discussion. You can see that we focused on the Central Development Region and Western regions of Nepal to collect this data. Next slide. So the campaigns that we tested were actually not previously existing campaigns. Instead, we engaged in a collaborative design process to make them from scratch. So in partnership with Dan Archer, a graphic journalist, and a range of anti-trafficking NGOs in Nepal, we made the campaigns for the study in order to reflect particularly the Nepali context and using sort of best practices that anti-trafficking organizations had applied to existing campaigns. And then we went through an extensive piloting process with various organizations that included philanthropic groups, community groups, NGOs, and to make sure that all of the campaigns were relevant and were pitched at appropriate levels of understanding for our population. So you'll see on the screen here pictures, some graphic notes that Dan took during his interviews at different organizations, and the recording of one of our radio campaigns. Next slide. So I'm now just going to show a little bit about what the campaigns ended up looking like, and you can actually see all of the campaigns we tested on our website, which I'll provide a link to at the end of the presentation. So this was our poster campaign that focused on a fact-based message. So you're seeing the English version. Respondents would have received a version in Nepali. And the poster just presents facts about human trafficking dynamics instead of giving a storyline or a narrative. Next slide. And then we created 3 different formats of narrative-based messages. We created a graphic novel, a radio drama, and a video. And each of them included the same 6 human trafficking stories that represented different forms of trafficking. So you'll see the different forms listed on the slide, and you're seeing a page out of our graphic novel of one of the stories. And so we created the graphic novel first and scripted all of the stories, and then we adapted it to all of the different formats. Next slide. So the other variation that we tested in our study was whether using a fear-based or negative appeal is more effective than using a positive appeal or an empowerment-based appeal. So what you're seeing now is 2 different, the end of one of our graphic novel stories. And one of the stories, the negative appeal, focuses on danger signs throughout the sort of trafficking process and uses fear to raise awareness, whereas the other one focuses on more positive and agency-based elements and uses empowerment to raise awareness. And I'm happy to, again, to talk more about the design of the design process of all these treatments in the discussion section. Next slide. So I'll talk a bit about some of the effects that we found to give you a sense of what the results were. We focused on a range of outcome measures, which included effects on perceptions of risk, attitudes towards victims, changes in practice, such as willingness to take action against trafficking. And all of these outcomes can be found in our reports, which I'll provide a link to our website where you can find them. But today I'm just going to focus on two outcome variables that we looked at, which were knowledge of human trafficking and perception of the scope of human trafficking. And I'll give you some what we found in the short term and then talk a little bit about how durable the effects were on those outcome measures. Next slide. So in terms of knowledge, we first examined baseline general knowledge with the following questions. So we asked a series of true or false statements. If human trafficking requires movement across national borders, it's false, and 61.8% of respondents answered it correctly in baseline. Human trafficking is a form of slavery, and 79.5% of respondents identified it correctly. Men can be trafficked. This statement is correct, and 80% of respondents identified it correctly at baseline. So overall, knowledge of human trafficking was higher than we expected, but where you really see room for improvement is potentially increasing awareness about domestic trafficking, which was quite low. Next slide. So in terms of results, human trafficking, we found that the anti-trafficking campaigns had a positive effect on improving knowledge. However, the effect of the fact-based poster was not statistically significant, and the empowerment campaign was more effective in increasing knowledge that men can be trafficked. But the difference was not statistically significant from the danger campaign. So there wasn't a significant difference between the two different appeals. Although the effects of receiving a campaign versus not receiving any campaign were significant, they decayed slightly in the long term. So this shows that campaigns are effective in improving knowledge, and that knowledge will decay a little bit, but it stays significant even 5 years after the initial exposure to the campaign. So we were quite surprised with the durability of effects on knowledge. So the next outcome variable I want to talk about, next slide, please, is looking at perceptions about the scope of human trafficking. So to measure perceptions of the prevalence of human trafficking, we asked respondents how big of a problem is human trafficking in Nepal, and how big of a problem is human trafficking in your own community or your ward. And 87.3% of people responded that it's either an extremely big or very big problem nationally, but only 7.4% responded that trafficking is an extremely big or very big problem locally. So there's definitely room for awareness campaigns to increase the understanding of the local nature of the problem, but it also shows that there may be an issue where awareness campaigns can really make a difference, which is that people tend to hold this idea that problems like trafficking don't happen to us or won't happen in our community. And a lot of our research sites were in places that have been noted by the Nepali government as being high risk of trafficking. So there's sort of a misperception amongst people or sort of a distancing themselves from this as a problem. So there's a real place for campaigns to make a difference there. Next slide. And what we actually found was that campaigns did, in fact, even though it was already high already, lead to an increase in people's perceptions that human trafficking is a national problem. And the empowerment campaigns were, again, more effective than the danger campaigns at increasing perceptions about the problem at a national level. And the effect of receiving a campaign versus not receiving a campaign in terms of increasing the perception that human trafficking is a national problem was also statistically significant in the medium and long term. So it was very durable. but there was no observable short-term or long-term difference in terms of a person's perception that human trafficking is a local problem. So going back to what I mentioned before, even after seeing a campaign, you still see this sort of distancing of the perception that one's own community might be experiencing this problem or that they're at risk. Next study. So just to summarize some of the main effects of the whole study, we did find that narrative campaigns perform better than fact-based campaigns, which is probably no surprise. There was a lack of a clear winner in terms of the media platform. So in terms of whether the graphic novel, radio, or video campaign were more powerful, we didn't see a clear winner. So here, localization and cost would be really important considerations. So in a context like Nepal, radio is very accessible and relatively cheap. So maybe worth focusing your efforts on doing a radio campaign. Generally, positive or empowerment-based appeals are more effective than negative or fear-based ones, which often contradicts what we see in some human trafficking campaigns, which can use a lot of fear-based messaging. And we found that campaigns were perform well at increasing knowledge and facts, but changing people's attitudes is a little bit more difficult and doesn't have as durable effects in the long term. So overall effects of mass media campaigns didn't consistently stand the test of time, which suggests a need to build in refreshers or repeat campaigns frequently. But good news on durability, we did see those really robust and long-lasting effects on knowledge outcomes even 5 years later. So you can really change what people know. So next slide, please. With that, I would like to thank all our donors. We received a lot of generous support to do this campaign. And I again want to acknowledge the co-PIs on this project, Cecilia Mo and Margaret Boitin. And thank you all for listening. And I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's very interesting to listening from the point of view of the researcher, of the academic, from the practitioner. So I think I would like to have some response from our panelists, who is the practitioner herself, Tara, and also Daniel as well for the input.
Sure. Thanks so much for an excellent presentation, but more importantly, such important research work. It's always refreshing to see when the research specialists come in and sort of reaffirm what we have learned from experience. I'd most like to echo your point about empowerment campaigns and how you saw them as being incredibly effective. We definitely found that in terms of behavior change. The importance of using modeling to model the desired behavior changes, to provide people with an alternative that is realistic and relevant to their lives to help prevent trafficking was vital. And we had some serious learnings in that space. So for example, in Bangladesh, we led a campaign that was encouraging individuals to check the validity of their visa by visiting a district employment manpower office. And we launched this amazing campaign to lead people to do that. But we found that one of the biggest problems was that we didn't model what actually visiting this office looked like. And so people weren't sure what it looked like, how they should get there. And so that learning was so important to inform the next campaign that we did in Myanmar, where we were promoting people visiting migrant resource centers. And in that, we made sure that our narrative storytelling actually showed people visiting a center, showing what that experience, to just reduce how intimidating it could be, or sort of the mystery around it. So yeah, great to see that was reflected in your results as well, Sarah.
Oh, thank you, Tara. That's an excellent example of the power of an empowering campaign. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that.
Daniel, do you have any additional points for this?
Yeah, sure. No, I think, yeah, thank you for that presentation. Very interesting. I think it's, consistent based on what we know from evaluating different types of campaigns and the execution of them. And also what we know from Nepal as a country. Every country is a little bit different. It's been a few years since we did research there, but from memory, in terms of migration and trafficking, women who migrate from Nepal into India, there is quite a lot of stigma. When they come back, they're labeled as having, worked in, as sex workers or something like that. Even if they didn't, there is kind of that perception. And so the whole community becomes in sort of denial of the problem. And I think your results clearly show that. And you're right, we can develop knowledge. Changing people's attitudes is something that takes longer, takes more effort. It doesn't happen, with one campaign. What we should keep in mind, I mean, there are a lot of times people sort of criticize campaigns that kind of mainly, the main impact is maybe on knowledge. And that is when we talk about human trafficking, traffickers rely on deception. So when they lure someone into their net, they don't expect them to know anything, and this is kind of a prerequisite. Once people have a bit of knowledge, they might start asking some questions. Who is the employer? Will I be able to contact my family? And as soon as traffickers hear these questions, they're going to back off and go and find someone else. So, and this is something that we found in research we did in Cambodia, for example, that just increasing that sort of level of knowledge and have people, asking a few questions about a potential job can often be enough to deter traffickers altogether.
Yeah, that's a great point. And one of the outcome measures that we did look at was stigma, and how these campaigns differently shape stigma around labor trafficking versus sex trafficking, and the associations that come with sex trafficking. And we did find actually that being exposed to the campaigns does reduce levels of victim blaming of sex trafficking victims. So there's more details about that in our report, but that was an outcome variable that we did look at. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody. We have a few questions here, and I think it would be great to collect all these questions and answer by the panelists for discussion at the Q&A session, because I think we have limited time. And okay, we move on to the final panelist. Daniel, I give you the floor now.
Okay, thank you. So first I want to congratulate Tara and Sarah for your excellent presentations. My presentation will be more from a research perspective as well. So how can we, uncover evidence for change? Apologies in advance if I happen to repeat something that has been already said or presented elsewhere in the conference. So at Rapid Asia, I should start the presentation here. Hang on. So share. And it's not sharing. Can you see it?
For me, it seems to be a blank screen right now. It says it seems like it's loading. Could you want to try stop sharing, Daniel, and then try sharing again? And if it doesn't work, I'd be happy to pull it up for you.
Okay, so I click the green button here, and then I
select your PowerPoint.
And then share, but why is it?
Oh, there we go.
Is it there now?
Yes, it's there now. And just make sure you're in presenter mode. Fantastic.
Okay. All right. Okay. Sorry for that. So at Rapid Asia, we try to translate, evidence for action as is the topic for this summit. We call it evidence for change, which I think is about the same thing. So I want to briefly explain what we mean by that, and then I have a couple of short case studies at the end. So all of our clients, and I assume everyone attending this summit, you all have one thing in common. You want to to change something, whether that is changing or introducing a new policy or changing beneficiary behavior. Either way, to realize that change, we need evidence. And that in a nutshell is what Rapid Asia does. So we go around the world and we find evidence for change, to make change actually happen. We sometimes call ourselves social development detectives. We call that, so what we do, we call that evidence-driven research. So what do we mean by that? Well, a lot of research, I would suggest, is a little bit sort of methodology driven. So if you look at the TOR, for example, it will outline, who is the target group, where should we... Sorry, there's a voice in the background. Sorry, there was some noise in the background. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Daniel.
Okay. So when we look at the TOR, for example, it will specify who we need to talk to, where we can find them, and then the how, so the data collection method. But at Rapid Asia, we like to sort of take a step back and try to think more deeply about what kind of evidence is it that we actually need to solve this problem, and where can we find that? So we think about that first, and then we can think of the how, which is the the methodology to achieve that goal. This is not to say that methodology-driven research can't yield good results. It can, but sometimes it doesn't. So we always take the opportunity to try and sort of look beyond what's in the brief itself. That is of course easy to say. It's not, I don't think it's easy to do. I think the biggest challenge that we face as a research community is that all projects are a bit different. And that means depending on the project we're looking at, the type of evidence that we need for change may well be different as well. At the very basic level, you could talk about evidence for change, or you could talk about evidence for impact. But underneath that, there are several issues that we may need to explore further to have really solid results. Some of you have already talked about behavior change, communication, and I think there are challenges around that too. Communication is an excellent tool for changing mindsets of people, in particular developing knowledge and so on. So but if you're looking to push people all the way to sort of adopt new behavior or compliant behavior, you also need a bit of a push from enforcement. And so a lot of times you can't just consider the communication, but you also got to look at the sort of the policy side. They two go hand in hand. Now, as I said, all programs are different. And if we take it for education, for example, it's relatively easy to do research and education because we already have access to some existing data, participation rates and things like that. And, if there is change, it is something that we can go out to the schools and we can observe it. But if we talk about human trafficking, it's quite the opposite. It's an illegal activity. It's intangible. And you're forced to go out and collect primary data. So in such situation, it's sometimes very useful to also consider some model or framework that you need to use. So I'm a big fan of using different types of models. Models are not just helpful as a research tool. I think they also help to really sell the results by presenting the evidence in a more compelling manner. So finally, I'll just share a couple of case studies to sort of connect the dots on some of the issues that I have raised here. So you're all familiar with how difficult it can be for migrant workers to enter destination countries using regular channels. The argument is we don't want people to come illegally. This is what governments will say. And the risk and reward study that we did for IOM and ILO a few years ago clearly showed how regulation can have quite the opposite effect. Migrants, what you see on the slide here, migrants who used regular channels, the ones in green, had to wait longer and had to pay 4 times as much because they were migrating regularly. So compared to irregular migrants, it takes longer and they pay more. On the other hand, if you're a regular, of course, you're also faced with greater risks. So that became the sort of the single most compelling evidence and finding, I think, from that study that really sort of forced policymakers to think about what are their policies actually achieving in the end. And another study, this is quite interesting. So some years ago, we did a campaign evaluation on a large $1 million drink driving campaign in Cambodia. We did a baseline and then we followed up with an impact study shortly after the campaign. Unfortunately, the campaign happened in an election year. So when the campaign launched, all the traffic police was taking off the street to deal with demonstrators. So our client tried in vain to delay the campaign, but they were told by the donor that no, they had to finish it before the end of the year. And the end result was of course devastating, with lower levels of compliance and more people doing drink driving. But fortunately, because of the study we did, and we collected evidence about how that behavior had changed, we were able to show that this wasn't the fault of the campaign. The fault really lied with the police being taken off the street. So people said, they had seen less police, their attitudes to drink driving had completely changed. And indeed, you had more people also conducting this kind of behavior because they knew the police was not around. So in the end, the campaign sort of didn't have a good result, but our evaluation received a lot of recognition because we were able to present that evidence. So anyway, I understand this presentation doesn't maybe really answer a lot of questions. It probably raises more questions. So I wanted to present this as a bit of a teaser to try and engage a discussion here. You will tell me if I have succeeded. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So I think I will have some response from the other panelists. Sarah and Tara, do you have any input on this presentation? And then we can move to the Q&A.
Oh, I guess I'll go ahead and go first.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Daniel, for that presentation. I love the work of Rapid Asia. As you know, we've worked together many times over the past years. But I really wanted to comment on your point around the significance of doing this kind of research. I think the term you used was to sort of sell results. But I think it really goes beyond that. One of the most, I feel like in a lot of discussions, we talk about how attitudes are a barrier to behavior change, right? And they are so challenging to shift. But it's one thing to comment on that, and it's another to have results from a baseline survey that show actual individuals' reactions of agreement or of strong agreement to highly xenophobic, discriminatory, or even racist comments about people most vulnerable to exploitation. So even to be able to have that baseline understanding of the population that you're dealing with is not only vital for informing the strategic approach that you take to your campaign design, but also for sensitizing key stakeholders, your donors, your government counterparts, your community counterparts, so that they appreciate that a one-year campaign is not going to fix this, right? This is going to be an investment over time where we are going to see incremental changes at best. And we're going to have to experiment because we are going to fail. We are going to fail to shift attitudes. And that's okay, provided that we learn and we don't make the same mistakes again. So I just really wanted to stress that really important point that Daniel made.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree, Tara, that and that's part of what we would call, evidence for change. Change can take many shapes and forms, and it can be, persuade policymakers, engage with, NGO partners, and so forth. All of that I regard as, evidence for some sort of change to enable, campaigns such as Iomx to, move the program forward. And that's always going to be sort of a gradual kind of a nudging process. You nudge bit by bit by bit, but you want to make sure that after each stage, you can show that evidence that yes, we haven't changed the world, but we have nudged forward incrementally.
Yeah, I just want to affirm that it's so great to hear about other evidence-based research that aligns a lot with our findings, and that we're able to sort of really build a strong knowledge base about what works and what's effective. So that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you all the panelists. I think we have a very great presentation from all three of them, but I think we have a limited time, but we still can answer 2 to 3 questions that were asked by the participants. And I think other questions can be answered in the Microsoft Teams conference community by our panelists later. So I think like one of the key questions I saw here is about, especially working on Sbcc, the point is to the shift behavioral and to change the attitude of people. So I think a lot of people might ask, and then I saw the question is, how do you measure that your campaign is working? I think that's a very important one, both from the practitioner and also from the researcher. How do you measure that this campaign or this message that you want to address to your target group is working? And I would say that I would want you to share about your challenges as well, that how your evaluation by those evidence being challenged by this process of the evaluation. Yeah, I'll give the floor to all of you.
Yeah, I can go first on that. Yeah, so when evaluating a campaign, I think the key for us is that you have to sort of segment. We always assume that maybe the campaign is not working as intended. Sometimes it can work, but a little bit as unintended, but still, it's a good result. So for example, you are targeting men and women, and the impact on men is non-existent, but you then look at women and then you actually see, well, they got the message, they got it. And so you can say, well, this campaign it doesn't work for everyone, but it's great for women. And so I think that is the key. It's never that a campaign is completely failed or completely successful. It has nuances. And we always try and pull out those sort of relativities to see, what is working well and what are the things that can be improved on. So you got to break it down, looking at sort of the target audience, looking at the message itself, looking at, the channels of communications and see what's working. So there's a lot of analysis that goes into this to really understand fully how the campaign is working and where it's not working.
Thank you, Daniel. Tara and Sarah, you want to add anything to that?
Well, maybe Sarah, were you also going to speak about sort of CAP and?
Yeah, that would be very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll let Sarah, and then I'll talk about behavior
Sure.
change. Oh, we can't hear you.
You are muted, Sarah.
Everyone can hear me now? Great.
Yes, go ahead.
I was going to add that in the research that we've done through the Human Trafficking Vulnerability Project, we've always tested campaigns that we designed through this sort of collaborative process. So we've never tested campaigns that were actually sort of applied for the purposes of like a practitioner purposes. But I would say that it might be for practitioners, it might be useful to think not only about testing the outcomes you were trying to shift, but often there can be unintended consequences of campaigns in terms of, issues like stigma. Like I think we found that our campaigns actually may have had unintended consequences in terms of stigmatizing labor trafficking or labor trafficking victims, for example. So you may want to look at outcomes that you may not directly be trying to shift in order to see if it's having potentially unintended consequences on shaping how people think about a problem or think about a victim of human trafficking or someone who's experienced exploitation. So that's one thing I will say. And in terms of KABP, knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and practices, which are the way we organize the outcome variables we were looking at in our study, we followed sort of standard, like in terms of research design, like questions that you would use to gauge those different things. But beliefs are really, I'd have to go back to look at the original design to see how we categorized each of the different outcome variables we looked at. But for example, I was talking about attitudes, which we gauged. We had a lot of different attitude-based outcomes, but things like stigmatization, things like victim blaming. And then in terms of beliefs, it was sort of things that people sort of hold to be true about trafficking, potentially their perceptions of certain like risk factors and things like that. And then knowledge was sort of testing on various facts about trafficking, right? Like the variables I showed in the presentation, like does trafficking include domestic trafficking, things like that. And practices, we also did a lot of interesting measures. We did a donation measure to see if people were willing to were more likely to donate money, if they were more likely to volunteer. We even, if they were more likely to sign a petition about anti-trafficking measures in their country. So we looked at things like that. Yeah. So hopefully that helps in terms of that question.
Absolutely. And maybe I'll just round up this response with measuring actual tangible behavior changes. So, a lot of, especially when we are doing campaigns in source communities, in general, a lot of campaigns are around promoting safe migration, right? But what does that actually mean in terms of behavior changes, right? It's actually a collection of many behavioral adoptions, because migration itself is a huge process with many decision-making points, with many influencing factors. And so you may have heard in my presentation that I made reference to a lot of our campaigns were incredibly targeted in that we were not promoting safe migration as a whole. We were promoting incredibly specific behavioral adoptions that were linked to community-based resources or online resources, depending on the media being used for the campaign. And so in this way, in principle, it seems like it would be easier to be able to measure behavioral adoption at the close of a campaign, right? So we had a great experience in Battambang back at MTV Exit, where we promoted Helpline, at events in Battambang. We promoted one specific hotline, and we were told after the fact by the administrator of that hotline that they saw an 80% increase in calls from that community in the month following that event, right? So tick, behavioral adoption. However, getting that kind of data from service providers is incredibly challenging. A lot of people or organizations that manage hotlines, they're not necessarily tracking this data. If they are, they don't necessarily want to share that externally because they don't necessarily want to admit that they were getting one call a month or 2 calls a month or 1 visitor to their migrant resource center, and that it went up to 5 or 10, because that influences maybe the donation they're getting, the support they're getting, or the perception of their services. So, you know, often, even though we built in these really concrete behavioral adoptions, and we really tried to measure, at best, sometimes we just got anecdotal, oh yeah, we got more calls or we got more visits. So I think it's an area, I flagged this because it's what we should be aspiring to do. We should be building this into every assessment of every initiative, and great if we can actually do it.
Thank you very much. I think we have a lot of questions that pouring in, but unfortunately we cannot answer all of it in our Q&A session. But of course, we will answer all of them in the Microsoft Teams. So I think I have been pinged by our technical facilitator that we kind of run out of time. So I think I will have the last question for all of your panelists to answer. I think it's a very good question. I think I want you to respond to what is one Sbcc good practice that everyone can start doing right now? I mean, from your point of view or from three of you, what kind of starting point from the organization or the practitioner or the researcher who is working on behavioral change or trying to capture those evidence-based research that try to find the result of the behavioral change to conduct the Sbcc activities. What would be your suggestion in that? We can start with Tara.
Sure, I'm going to leave the specific research recommendations to Daniel and Sarah, but from a practice perspective, I'm going to say pre-test, pre-test, pre-test. And this is again from learnings. Just another quick story. We were developing a series of short films about targeting employers of domestic workers, about how best to treat, how to respect the labor rights of domestic workers in their homes. And so we had this script. We convened a focus group discussion with employers of domestic workers. And following the script reading, at the end, we asked them what they thought it was about, key messages. Not a single person in that room even noticed the domestic worker as a key character, right? And so, of course, we had to go back to the drawing board. We had to go back to our script writer and update it. And before moving forward with production. And thank goodness we did that, because we risked launching a campaign with a video that people just people completely missed the point. So whether or not you can do a focus group discussion, if you're just share your pamphlet or your poster with a representative of your target audience, just make sure that it's understood and liked before you roll out mass production and dissemination.
Thank you, Tara. Sarah and Daniel, would you like to have the input from your researcher side for this?
Sarah, you can go first.
Sure, I can go next. It's interesting because I was actually going to say sort of what I thought from our results in terms of how they could be implemented in practice, and I think what Tara said is absolutely correct in terms of what we found, which is we looked at so many different formats of campaigns, and certainly there's many that you can choose from. But one of the things that we found was that given that there's no clear winner, it's really important to understand the context in which you're rolling out a campaign, and not necessarily be attached to a particular format, but look at what is going to be most accessible to the population that you're interested in studying. I also think, or in implementing the campaign. Again, we piloted extensively, and like Tara mentioned, we found throughout the piloting process that there were all sorts of issues that came up in the campaign, even focusing on people's skin color, how you represent ethnicity, accents. All of these things can shape whether someone relates to that campaign or distances themselves from that. So I would say, again, like I want to reiterate the importance of doing piloting, particularly with the populations that you want to be targeting. Because I think a lot of the times organizations take a one-size-fits-all approach and do a campaign somewhere else and kind of, try it out in a different place. So I think contextualizing is extremely important, and piloting and learning from that process.
Thank you, Sarah. Daniel, your comments on this?
Yeah. No, I go back to our heading of the presentation, that is evidence for change and evidence for impact. If you don't measure it, you're not going to know it. I've been to many conferences, seminars that deals with, behavior change. And it's amazing to me that a lot of the things that are being presented as examples of, how they measure a successful campaign, all the examples are always something that's very tangible. So it's like safety helmets or, some, vaccine or, saving electricity in your home. All of these things, there is readily available data. You can go out, you can observe it. So it's very easy to measure impact. Very easy to do, relatively speaking. But if you're talking about safe migration, if you talk about human trafficking, and these are sort of preventative campaigns. And if you're trying to prevent something from happening, you can't really prove that what you did has achieved something. You're trying to prove an unknown. You can't say that, oh, because we trained these people and they migrated safely, oh, that was because of our training. There is no evidence for that. And so people need to realize that when you're in this kind of human trafficking or prevention sort of space, you're dealing with these unknown factors, and to measure that is not only paramount, but it's also difficult. And so that's something that I think people should take home and realize that if that's the space they're working in, then measurement is going to become so much more important, because you're not going to have observational evidence or evidence from, secondary data.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And I think we're coming to the final part of our session today. I would like to thank Tara, Sarah, and Daniel for very great presentations. I really enjoy it from both part of practitioner and researcher part. And I think we all get a lot of information from the experience of everybody in the panel about their works in the Sbcc campaigns. And I think there are a lot of things to share with all the participant questions later as well. And I think this is a great connection that we have with all the Sbcc practitioners and also researchers or people who interest in the Sbcc or Communication for Development part of the program. And I think I want to conclude all the session and hand over this floor back to Am.
Thank you so much, Kunwarapon, and thank you so much, everyone, for today. Thank you for attending the Evidence to Action Summit and today's session, and apologies that we didn't have quite enough time to answer all of your fantastic questions. Thank you again, Kunwarapon, for the fantastic moderation, and Tara, Sarah, and Daniel for your fantastic presentations and answers to participants' questions. I know I have a lot to think about and to chew on from this panel, and I'm sure that participants all do as well. To everyone, please do join us at the other sessions in this summit. All registered participants have received calendar invites, a participants guide, email reminders, and reminders on Microsoft Teams for all the sessions at the summit. The next session will be Barriers to Evidence Uptake, Civil Society Perspectives, and it's taking place at 2 p.m. on Bangkok time. As Kunwarapon has previously mentioned, please do continue the conversation on the conference community on Microsoft Teams. The panelists can continue to answer your questions there, and this afternoon I will be sure to duplicate and reshare all of the questions and comments that you have already said today in the chat. The conference community is also a really great place to be, especially if you are interested in finding collaborators for the pitch competition that is being offered through participation in this summit. Thank you again for your participation, everyone, and have a fantastic day.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Daniel, Sarah. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Thanks all of you. I think it was successful. Yes.
Yeah, very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.